For 6 weeks, a wild black stallion had been causing havoc at Lonear Ranch. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, 10-year-old Luke Chapman arrived and calmly announced he could soothe the animal that had already sent 3 professional wranglers to the hospital. Ranch owner Harrison Mitchell watched from his porch as the small boy approached the fence where his prized quarter horses huddled together, clearly afraid. The Mustang stood alone in the distant pasture, its midnight coat gleaming under the desert sun, muscles rippling as it paced like a caged panther. No human had gotten within 50 feet without the horse charging. Luke had come to the ranch just that morning with his elderly guardian, Mrs. Lacey, who had answered Harrison's advertisement for a housekeeper. The boy was quiet and polite, possessing an unusual understanding of animals that Harrison couldn't quite explain. "Son," Harrison called out, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing, "you need to stay away from that fence." Luke turned, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. "He's not dangerous, Mr. Mitchell." The words sent a chill down Harrison's spine. Protecting what? His family or the memory of them? Harrison studied the boy more carefully. There was something familiar about Luke's face, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. The child had the lean build of a natural rider and carried himself with a quiet confidence that reminded Harrison of someone from long ago. Harrison asked, stepping down from the porch. The honesty in the boy's voice hit Harrison harder than he expected. Mrs. Lacey had mentioned Luke was an orphan, but she'd been vague about the details. Looking at the child now, Harrison saw a resilience that spoke of experiences no 10-year-old should have to endure. "Luke," he said gently, "that horse showed up on my land 3 weeks ago. He's been attacking my livestock and destroying fences." Luke's voice carried a note of alarm. "I have to protect my other animals and my ranch hands," Harrison replied. Luke looked back at the stallion, who had stopped pacing and was now staring directly at them. Harrison hesitated. The truth was harsh, but the boy deserved honesty. The pain that flashed across Luke's face was so raw that Harrison felt his chest tighten. Without another word, the boy walked closer to the fence, ignoring Harrison's sharp warning to stay back. The stallion's head lifted, ears pricked forward with interest rather than aggression. As Luke approached, the magnificent horse moved toward the fence with fluid grace, stopping just out of arm's reach. "Hello, beautiful," Luke whispered, his voice barely carrying on the desert breeze. "I know you're scared." Harrison watched in amazement as the stallion took another step closer, nostrils flaring as he scented the air around Luke. The horse's previous aggressive posture had completely disappeared, replaced by cautious curiosity. "Mrs. Lacey," Harrison called to the elderly woman who had emerged from the ranch house. "Only 6 months," she replied, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening breeze. Mrs. Lacey's expression grew pained. "Car accident last year, both parents died instantly. Luke spent months in the hospital with injuries." Harrison felt a stab of sympathy. No wonder the boy understood loss so deeply. "Northern Nevada, I believe." The words hit Harrison like lightning. Northern Nevada, wild horses. A memory surfaced from 15 years ago of a young man named David Chapman who had worked briefly at the ranch specializing in Mustang gentling. David had been passionate about wild horse conservation and had left to start his own sanctuary. "Mrs. Lacey," Harrison said carefully. She nodded. "David Chapman." Harrison's legs nearly gave out. He gripped the fence post for support as the implications crashed over him. "Yes," he whispered. That evening, after Luke had reluctantly left the stallion and gone inside for dinner, Harrison sat alone on his porch, wrestling with memories he'd tried to bury for over a decade. David Chapman had worked at Lonear Ranch during one of the most difficult periods of Harrison's life. Harrison's daughter, Clare, had been 16 then, rebellious, angry at the world, and furious with her father for moving the family from the city to the remote ranch after her mother's death. David, only 22 at the time, had been hired to help with a herd of rescued Mustangs, that the Bureau of Land Management had placed on the ranch. Clare had been instantly captivated by David's gentle way with the horses and his passionate stories about wild Mustang herds running free across the Nevada landscape. Harrison had watched his daughter come alive around David in a way she hadn't since her mother's passing. But Harrison had also seen something else developing between the young horse trainer and his teenage daughter. Something that terrified him as a protective father. When he discovered Clare sneaking out to meet David in the evening, he'd exploded with rage and fear. The confrontation had been ugly. Harrison accused David of taking advantage of Clare, threatened to have him arrested, and fired him on the spot. David had tried to explain that he cared for Clare and would never hurt her, but Harrison wouldn't listen. He'd driven the young man away that very night. Clare had been devastated. She'd screamed that Harrison had ruined her life, that David was the only person who understood her. 3 days later, she'd run away, leaving only a note saying she was going to find David and that Harrison would never see her again. That had been 15 years ago. Despite hiring private investigators and spending thousands of dollars searching, Harrison had never found his daughter. David Chapman had seemingly vanished as well, and with him any hope of locating Clare. Now sitting in the gathering darkness, Harrison wondered if Luke might hold the key to finding his long-lost daughter. If David had indeed been the boy's father, then perhaps Clare had been in Luke's life too. The possibility filled him with equal measures of hope and terror. The next morning, Harrison was awakened by commotion in the yard. Through his bedroom window, he saw his ranch hands gathered around the pasture fence, pointing and talking excitedly. He dressed quickly and hurried outside to find Luke already at the fence, with the black stallion standing calmly just a few feet away. Harrison asked his foreman, Pete Rodriguez. "About an hour," Pete replied, shaking his head in amazement. Harrison watched as Luke spoke softly to the stallion, his small hands moving in gentle gestures. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, tracking every word and movement with focused attention. "Luke," Harrison said carefully, approaching the fence. The boy looked over his shoulder. "Did your father ever tell you about working at a ranch in Arizona?" Luke's eyes widened with surprise. "I did. He used to tell me stories about this place," Luke said excitedly. He stopped suddenly, his expression growing uncertain. Luke looked away. Harrison's heart hammered against his ribs. The words hit Harrison like physical blows. "Did he?" Luke nodded slowly. "She found him in Nevada." The world seemed to tilt around Harrison. Married. Harrison's legs gave out completely. He sat down hard in the dirt, staring at Luke with new understanding. This wasn't just David Chapman's son. This was his grandson, Clare's child. "Are you okay, Mr.?" Luke asked, concern evident in his young voice. Harrison struggled to find words. 15 years of searching. 15 years of wondering if his daughter was alive, and she'd been living in Nevada, married to David, raising a son who was now standing in front of him. "Luke," he managed to whisper, "Clare was my daughter." The boy's eyes went wide. But Mom never talked about her family." The pain in those words cut deep. Clare had chosen to cut all ties with her past, even denying Luke the knowledge of his grandfather's existence. Harrison understood why he'd driven her away with his anger and stubbornness, making her feel like she had no choice but to disappear completely. Mrs. Lacey had approached during their conversation and now stood listening with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Luke," she said softly, Harrison asked. "The boy has had nightmares since the accident, not just about losing his parents, but about a ranch with horses. He kept saying he had to get back to the horses, that someone was waiting for him." Harrison looked at Luke, who was staring at him with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "I've been dreaming about it," Luke admitted, "but I thought they were just dreams." Harrison's throat constricted. "I don't know." The implication hung heavy in the air. Clare and David had brought their son to the ranch but had stayed hidden, perhaps watching from a distance, never making contact. The thought of his daughter being so close without him knowing was almost unbearable. A sudden whinny from the stallion broke the emotional tension. The horse was pacing again, but this time his movement seemed agitated rather than aggressive. "Something's wrong," Luke said, immediately turning his attention back to the horse. As if responding to the boy's words, the stallion moved to the gate of his enclosure and began pawing at the ground, his dark eyes fixed on the distant hills that bordered the ranch. "I think he wants to go somewhere," Luke said. Harrison studied the horse's behavior, recognizing the signs of an animal trying to communicate urgent need. "Pete," he called to his foreman. Mrs. Lacey looked alarmed. "Mister, that horse showed up on my ranch for a reason," Harrison interrupted, "and Luke is the only one who can communicate with him." 20 minutes later, Harrison and Luke rode slowly across the desert terrain on the ATV, following the black stallion who moved ahead of them with purposeful strides. The horse would periodically stop and look back, ensuring they were still following before continuing toward the rocky hills that marked the northern boundary of the ranch. "Grandpa," Luke said, the words sounding strange and wonderful on his young lips. Harrison's chest tightened at being called Grandpa for the first time. Why did Mom leave? Harrison struggled with how much truth a 10-year-old could handle. "I made a terrible mistake, Luke. I was scared of losing your mother, and my fear made me angry. I thought your father wasn't good enough for your mother. I was wrong, but I couldn't see that then." Luke was quiet for several minutes as they bounced across the rough terrain. The question pierced Harrison's heart. "I hope so." They continued following the stallion deeper into the hills, along paths that Harrison hadn't traveled in years. The horse seemed to know exactly where he was going, moving with the confidence of an animal on familiar ground. After nearly an hour of riding, the stallion stopped at the entrance to a narrow canyon that Harrison recognized with a start. It was Devil's Canyon, a place he'd avoided for years because of its treacherous terrain and hidden drop-offs. Harrison muttered. Luke climbed off the ATV and approached the stallion, who stood perfectly still as the boy came near. For the first time, Luke reached out and touched the horse's neck, running his small hand along the powerful muscles beneath the midnight coat. "He's not just showing us the way," Luke said quietly. Luke looked up at Harrison with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than his 10 years. "This is where Mom and Dad brought me, I remember now. There's a hidden valley in this canyon where wild horses come to foal." Harrison's breath caught. A hidden valley meant water and shelter, exactly the kind of place David would have chosen for a secret family retreat. The boy nodded, his hands still resting on the stallion's neck. "The last time we came here, I was about 7. Mom made Dad promise it would be our special secret place." The implications hit Harrison like an avalanche. Claire had maintained this connection to the ranch, to the land where she'd grown up, even after cutting ties with her father. She'd been planning to eventually bridge the gap between her two worlds, her childhood home and the family she'd built with David. The stallion began moving again, leading them deeper into the canyon, along a path so narrow that Harrison had to leave the ATV behind. They walked single file, with Luke staying close to the horse and Harrison following behind, marveling at how the wild stallion had become as gentle as a riding school pony in the boy's presence. The canyon walls rose higher around them, blocking out much of the afternoon sun and creating a sense of entering a sacred space. Harrison could hear the sound of running water ahead, and his amazement grew as they rounded a bend and emerged into a hidden valley that took his breath away. The valley was perhaps 2 acres in size, surrounded by sheer rock walls but filled with lush grass and fed by a natural spring that bubbled up from the rocks to form a clear stream. Ancient cottonwood trees provided shade, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the water's edge, but it wasn't the natural beauty that made Harrison's knees go weak. It was the sight of a small cabin tucked beneath the largest cottonwood tree, with a corral built nearby showing clear signs of recent habitation. "Mom and Dad built that," Luke said softly. Harrison approached the cabin with trembling steps, noting the careful craftsmanship and the love that had obviously gone into its construction. Through the windows, he could see simple furniture, books, and personal belongings that spoke of a family's secret retreat. On the small porch, a wooden sign hung by the door. "There's something else," Luke said, leading Harrison around to the back of the cabin. Behind the structure, in a grove of aspens, 3 wooden crosses marked grave. 2 were larger, bearing the names David Chapman and Clare Chapman, along with dates from the previous year. The 3rd, smaller cross was unmarked but clearly prepared for a future occupant. Harrison sank to his knees beside his daughter's grave. 15 years of grief and regret crashed over him like a dam bursting. Clare had taken David's name but had also kept Mitchell, perhaps holding on to some connection to her family despite their estrangement. "They died in Nevada," Luke said quietly, sitting beside his grandfather. "But Dad always said they wanted to be buried here if anything happened." Harrison asked through his tears. "Mrs. Lacey helped me. She knew about this place because Mom had written about it in letters. After the funeral in Nevada, we brought them here secretly." Mrs. Harrison looked at his grandson with new admiration. At just 10 years old, Luke had managed to fulfill his parents' final wishes and return them to their sacred place. The boy's maturity and strength were staggering. Harrison asked. Luke's expression grew sad. "Dad always said this place was meant for 3 generations. The generosity of David's spirit, even after the way Harrison had treated him, was almost too much to bear. Luke, I need you to know something. Your father was a good man, better than I was." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of running water and the wind in the aspens. The black stallion had moved to the stream to drink, and Harrison watched as several wild horses emerged from the far end of the valley, mares with foals and a few younger stallions who approached the black horse with obvious respect. "He's their lead stallion," Luke explained. "This is his herd. The spring is running low because of the drought." Harrison understood now. The stallion hadn't been attacking his ranch. He'd been testing the boundaries, trying to determine if it was safe to bring his herd down for water. When traditional methods failed, he'd somehow known to wait for Luke, the one human who could bridge the gap between wild and domestic, between past and present. Harrison asked his grandson. Luke stood and walked to the stallion, who lowered his magnificent head to the boy's level. They seemed to communicate without words, and Harrison watched in wonder as his grandson demonstrated the same gift with horses that his father had possessed. "He wants to know if his family will be safe on your ranch," Luke said finally. Harrison thought about his sprawling ranch, the thousands of acres that could easily support a small herd of wild horses. He thought about his daughter, who had loved these creatures with the same passion as her husband. Most of all, he thought about the grandson he'd just discovered, who clearly had inherited that same deep connection to the wild horses. "Tell him yes," Harrison said. "Tell him the ranch will always be a sanctuary for his herd." Luke's face lit up with joy as he turned back to the stallion, speaking in soft tones that carried across the valley. The horse's response was immediate, a loud, trumpeting call that was answered by the entire herd. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Harrison and Luke made their way back toward the ranch, accompanied by the stallion and his family. The horses moved with quiet confidence now, no longer fearful but trusting in the promise of sanctuary. "Grandpa," Luke said as they walked, "Mrs. Lacey has been looking for a permanent home for me." Harrison's heart leaped. "Could I? Luke, this ranch has been in our family for 4 generations. Someday, if you want it, it'll be yours, but more than that, I need you here." They spent the evening planning the integration of the wild herd into ranch life, discussing the construction of larger pastures and additional water sources. Mrs. Lacey, delighted that Luke had found his family, agreed to stay on as housekeeper and surrogate grandmother, completing the circle of care around the boy. Over the following weeks, the transformation of Lonear Ranch was remarkable. The wild horses thrived in their new environment, and Luke proved to be a natural horseman with an intuitive understanding of equine behavior that amazed even veteran ranch hands. The black stallion, whom Luke named Shadow for his midnight coat, became the boys' constant companion and helped train other horses on the ranch. Together, they developed a program for gentling wild mustangs that attracted attention from horse trainers across the country. 3 months after Luke's arrival, Harrison stood on his porch watching his grandson work with a young Mustang filly in the training corral. The boy's patience and skill were evident as he slowly built trust with the frightened animal, using techniques that combined his father's methods with innovations entirely his own. "He's special," Mrs. Lacey said, joining Harrison on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Just like his parents," Harrison replied. "Do you think he'll stay when he grows up?" Harrison considered the question. "I think Luke will always be drawn to wild places and wild horses. But this ranch is his heritage. It's where his story began, even if he didn't know it at first." That evening, as they did every night, Harrison and Luke visited the hidden valley to check on the wild herd and spend time at Clare and David's grave. Luke had started bringing wildflowers to place on the grave, and tonight he'd picked a particularly beautiful bouquet of desert lupins. "Mom always loved purple flowers," he said, arranging them carefully. "So did your grandmother." Luke looked up with interest. Harrison settled beside the grave, grateful for the opportunity to share family history with his grandson. "She was a lot like your mother, strong-willed, passionate about horses, and never afraid to speak her mind." Harrison looked at the peaceful valley, at the wild horses grazing contentedly by the stream, at his grandson's earnest face in the gathering twilight. As they prepared to leave the valley, Shadow approached Luke for their nightly farewell ritual. The stallion would lower his head, and Luke would whisper something in his ear, a private communication between boy and horse that never failed to move Harrison. Harrison asked as they walked back through the canyon. Luke nodded seriously. "Shadow knew exactly where to find me, Grandpa. Mrs. Lacey said he appeared at our house in Nevada the day after the accident, like he was waiting for me to be ready to come back here." Harrison felt chills run down his spine. The idea that his daughter and David might have somehow orchestrated Luke's return to the ranch seemed impossible. Yet the sequence of events had been too perfect to be mere coincidence. That night, Harrison sat at his desk writing letters to local officials about establishing legal protection for the wild herd, to horse rescue organizations about expanding the ranch's sanctuary program, and to his lawyer about updating his will to ensure Luke's inheritance would be secure. He also wrote a letter he'd been meaning to compose for 15 years, a letter to Clare and David expressing his regret, his love, and his gratitude for the incredible gift of their son. He sealed it in an envelope addressed simply to "my daughter and the man she loved," and placed it in his desk drawer, planning to read it aloud at their grave the next day. A year later, Lonear Ranch had become renowned as a premier wild horse sanctuary and training facility. Luke, now 11, had been featured in horse magazines and documentary films for his remarkable ability to communicate with wild mustangs. He'd also started a blog called Shadow Stories, sharing tales of ranch life and wild horse conservation that had attracted thousands of followers. The ranch hosted school groups, university researchers, and horse enthusiasts from around the world. Luke had become an eloquent spokesperson for wild horse protection, speaking with a maturity and passion that reminded everyone who knew him of his parents' legacy. On the anniversary of his parents' death, Luke stood beside their grave with Harrison, Mrs. Lacey, and several ranch hands who had become like family. He read a letter he'd written to his parents, telling them about his life at the ranch, his growing skill with horses, and the grandfather who loved him unconditionally. "I want them to know that I'm happy," Luke said as he finished reading. Shadow stood nearby, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment. The stallion had become a legend in his own right, leading his herd to safety and serving as the foundation sire for a new generation of ranch horses that combined wild spirit with gentle temperament. Harrison asked as they walked back to the ranch house. Luke considered the question seriously. "I think he would have found another way to bring me here. Some things are just meant to be, Grandpa." As the sun set over Lonear Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Harrison reflected on the truth of those words. Love had indeed found a way through a wild stallion's journey, through a boy's courage, and through the redemptive power of second chances. The ranch that had once been a place of loss and regret had become a sanctuary for both wild horses and wounded hearts. Luke had brought healing not just to Shadow's herd, but to his grandfather's spirit, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. If this story of family, forgiveness, and wild horses has touched you, please help us share its message with others who might need it. Take a moment to subscribe and join our community of animal lovers. We truly appreciate your support as we bring you more stories like this one. Mind, she would have loved you tremendously. Do you think Mom and Dad are happy that they're together wherever they are? Harrison looked at the peaceful valley, at the wild horses grazing contentedly by the stream, at his grandson's earnest face in the gathering twilight. "I think they're at peace, Luke, and I think they're proud of what you've accomplished here." As they prepared to leave the valley, Shadow approached Luke for their nightly farewell ritual. The stallion would lower his head, and Luke would whisper something in his ear, a private communication between boy and horse that never failed to move Harrison. "What do you tell him?" Harrison asked as they walked back through the canyon. "I tell him about my day, about the things I learned, about my plans for tomorrow, and I thank him for bringing me home." "He brought you home?" Luke nodded seriously. "Shadow knew exactly where to find me, Grandpa. Mrs. Lacey said he appeared at our house in Nevada the day after the accident, like he was waiting for me to be ready to come back here. I think Mom and Dad sent him to guide me home when I needed family the most." Harrison felt chills run down his spine. The idea that his daughter and David might have somehow orchestrated Luke's return to the ranch seemed impossible. Yet the sequence of events had been too perfect to be mere coincidence. That night, Harrison sat at his desk writing letters to local officials about establishing legal protection for the wild herd, to horse rescue organizations about expanding the ranch's sanctuary program, and to his lawyer about updating his will to ensure Luke's inheritance would be secure. He also wrote a letter he'd been meaning to compose for 15 years, a letter to Clare and David expressing his regret, his love, and his gratitude for the incredible gift of their son. He sealed it in an envelope addressed simply to "my daughter and the man she loved," and placed it in his desk drawer, planning to read it aloud at their grave the next day. A year later, Lonear Ranch had become renowned as a premier wild horse sanctuary and training facility. Luke, now 11, had been featured in horse magazines and documentary films for his remarkable ability to communicate with wild mustangs. He'd also started a blog called Shadow Stories, sharing tales of ranch life and wild horse conservation that had attracted thousands of followers. The ranch hosted school groups, university researchers, and horse enthusiasts from around the world. Luke had become an eloquent spokesperson for wild horse protection, speaking with a maturity and passion that reminded everyone who knew him of his parents' legacy. On the anniversary of his parents' death, Luke stood beside their grave with Harrison, Mrs. Lacey, and several ranch hands who had become like family. He read a letter he'd written to his parents, telling them about his life at the ranch, his growing skill with horses, and the grandfather who loved him unconditionally. "I want them to know that I'm happy," Luke said as he finished reading, "that I'm exactly where I belong." Shadow stood nearby, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment. The stallion had become a legend in his own right, leading his herd to safety, and serving as the foundation sire for a new generation of ranch horses that combined wild spirit with gentle temperament. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Shadow hadn't appeared that day?" Harrison asked as they walked back to the ranch house. Luke considered the question seriously. "I think he would have found another way to bring me here. Some things are just meant to be, Grandpa. Mom used to say that love always finds a way, even when it seems impossible." As the sun set over Lonear Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Harrison reflected on the truth of those words. Love had indeed found a way through a wild stallion's journey, through a boy's courage, and through the redemptive power of second chances. The ranch that had once been a place of loss and regret had become a sanctuary for both wild horses and wounded hearts. Luke had brought healing not just to Shadow's herd, but to his grandfather's spirit, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. If this story of family, forgiveness, and wild horses has touched you, please help us share its message with others who might need it. Take a moment to subscribe and join our community of animal lovers. We truly appreciate your support as we bring you more stories like this one.